What begins as a routine morning interview quickly spirals into one of the most explosive moments in live television history. The legendary Clint Eastwood, at 94 years old, agreed to appear on Good Morning America to promote what might be his final film, a farewell project, decades in the making. For the network, it was a rare and prestigious booking. Eastwood had long avoided television appearances, preferring the quiet dignity of his work over publicity tours. Producers prepared everything meticulously, a tribute montage, pre-screened questions, and a reverent tone fitting the stature of their guest. George Stephanopoulos, the seasoned host, was expected to guide the conversation respectfully, but what transpired would leave the studio, and the world, in stunned silence. From the moment Eastwood stepped onto the set, there was a sense of gravity in the air. He moved slowly but purposefully, every motion deliberate. His icy blue gaze swept the room, assessing everything with the intensity of a man who had spent a lifetime measuring the motives of others. He sat down with quiet precision, adjusted his jacket, and offered a curt nod to Stephanopoulos, who greeted him with a polished smile. "Morning," Eastwood said in his unmistakable, gravelly tone, calm, alert, unamused. The interview started predictably. Questions about his latest film, his process, and his reflections on a career that had spanned over 60 years flowed easily. Eastwood spoke with modest confidence, highlighting the talent of his cast and the personal nature of the project. But just as the audience settled into a nostalgic journey through Eastwood's legendary career, Stephanopoulos pivoted. "Clint, you've been in this business a long time," he began. "You've witnessed tremendous change, especially around issues of representation and diversity in Hollywood. How do you feel about those changes?" The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't on the docket." He paused before responding, his voice measured. "Good stories are good stories, George, regardless of who tells them. I've always believed in hiring the best person for the job, but don't you think the industry needed to change?" Stephanopoulos pressed. There were systemic issues that needed addressing. The studio air grew colder. Eastwood's jaw tensed, a signal that any longtime viewer would recognize as a warning. He responded evenly. "Filmmaking is about honest stories and real characters. Once you start making movies to check boxes, you're not making art. You're pushing propaganda." A quiet ripple of discomfort moved through the audience. Stephanopoulos leaned forward, sensing an opening. "But isn't it also political to ignore those issues? To pretend representation doesn't matter?" "I'm not pretending anything," Eastwood replied, voice low but sharp. "I'm saying if you start prioritizing ideology over storytelling, you're doing a disservice to both." That struck a nerve. Stephanopoulos' tone grew more pointed. "Some might say you speak from a place of privilege, that you've never had to worry about representation." Eastwood's eyes flashed. "Privilege? I grew up during the Great Depression, George. Dug swimming pools. Worked steel mills. I didn't get here because of privilege. I got here because I didn't quit." "But you must acknowledge," Stephanopoulos continued, "that opportunities weren't equally distributed. The system was biased. The system was tough." Eastwood cut in. "That's not the same thing. I spent years doing bit parts, taking rejections, scraping by. No one handed me anything because I was a white guy. I earned it." Backstage, producers panicked. This wasn't the warm tribute segment they had envisioned. This was live, raw, and quickly spiraling into something they couldn't control. "I think you're missing the point," Stephanopoulos said. "The system favored certain people. People like you. There's a difference between difficult and unfair." Eastwood said coolly. "Life's not easy. Films aren't therapy. Not everyone gets a trophy." Stephanopoulos flushed slightly, his professional calm fraying. "So you're saying there were no barriers?" "There are always barriers," Eastwood replied. "Question is, do you spend your life complaining about them, or do you get past them?" The mood on set was electric. A few audience members exchanged worried glances. Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down, and Eastwood wasn't giving an inch. This wasn't an interview anymore, it was a standoff. "But Clint, your generation did have advantages. The old boy network. The exclusion of others. My generation," Eastwood's voice dropped. "You mean the generation that fought a world war? That rebuilt this country? That generation? I mean the one that controlled Hollywood while keeping others out." Stephanopoulos shot back. The studio went dead. Quiet. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, studying his host with the same withering glare that once made villains sweat in dusty saloons. "You've got me confused with someone else," he said coldly. "I've never shut anyone out. I hired people who could do the job. Period." Stephanopoulos wasn't done. "That's easy to say now. But the record speaks for itself. How many diverse casts did you feature? How many women did you direct?" Eastwood gripped the arms of his chair. "I made films about real people, soldiers, cowboys, underdogs. Not based on checklists, but stories that mattered. You want quotas? Go look somewhere else." So you admit diversity wasn't a priority. I admit storytelling was, always has been. But you only showed America from one perspective. Stephanopoulos pressed. White, male, conservative. That snapped Eastwood's legendary restraint. Conservative, he said, voice rising. You think Unforgiven was conservative. You think $1 Million Baby was some kind of right-wing fantasy. You clearly haven't been paying attention. Those are exceptions, Stephanopoulos insisted. Most of your work reflects a specific worldview. Eastwood leaned in, his stare blistering. My worldview is about responsibility, hard work, and respect. If that offends you, maybe you're the one with the problem. Control room, chaos, surged. Producers debated cutting the feed, but the cameras kept rolling. This was too big to ignore now. But don't your films reinforce toxic masculinity? That violence is the answer. Stephanopoulos demanded. Eastwood rose from his chair, the scraping sound echoing through the studio. You want to talk stereotypes? He asked, towering over his host. How about the stereotype that anyone who disagrees with you is a racist or a sexist? That's what you're doing, slapping labels because it's easier than listening. I'm just asking questions. No, you're not, Eastwood said. You're staging an ambush. You invited me here under false pretenses. This was supposed to be about my film. But you're not interested in that. You want a villain for your little narrative. Stephanopoulos tried to push back, but Eastwood wasn't done. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've taken criticism from the best, but I've never been told I'm a bad person because my films don't match your politics. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant, Eastwood snapped. Don't hide behind the word discussion. You wanted a fight? Well, here it is. The studio audience was frozen. Even the cameramen held their breath. I am trying to have a meaningful conversation about legacy and influence. You're trying to manufacture a viral moment. Eastwood cut in. You want to bait me into saying something controversial. Clip it. Spin it. Use it. Stephanopoulos' face burned with frustration. Maybe you just can't handle being questioned. Maybe you're not used to someone challenging your outdated views. Eastwood stared at him for a long, dangerous moment. Then he spoke, his voice like a blade. Outdated. Let me tell you what's outdated. Demanding respect without earning it, expecting applause for mediocrity. Thinking your identity matters more than your integrity. If that's your idea of progress, then count me out. We live in a world that's moved beyond simplistic morality, Stephanopoulos argued. Today's audience wants complexity. Eastwood laughed, not kindly. Complexity. I made movies about a racist learning empathy, a woman fighting the world, a soldier questioning war. Do you think that's simplistic? Maybe you just didn't get the message. You framed those stories through a masculine lens, Stephanopoulos said, a problematic one. Problematic? Eastwood scoffed. Everything's problematic to you people. Working hard, protecting family, standing your ground. You've turned decency into something to apologize for. The set was silent. Eastwood's anger now radiated from every word. I've made movies for over 50 years, he said, with people from every background. But I didn't write press releases about it. I just did the work. Stephanopoulos leaned in again. But your influence shaped Hollywood in ways that weren't always positive. That did it? Eastwood's calm shattered. My influence, he thundered. I helped build an industry, gave people jobs, told stories that still matter. That's more than you'll ever do from behind that desk. Stephanopoulos opened his mouth, but Eastwood shut it down with a glare that could stop traffic. You've never risked anything. Never had to fight for a vision. Never had to look a crew in the eye and tell them they're out of work. But you sit here and judge people who have. The interview had gone completely off the rails, and it was only just beginning. Stephanopoulos tried to retake control of the interview, his voice climbing in desperation. That's exactly the kind of thinking that's kept Hollywood from progressing. This obsession with profit over principles. Eastwood stared at him, stunned at the naivety. Profit over principles. He repeated slowly, as though weighing the absurdity of the accusation. George, without profit, there are no movies. Without commercial success, there are no jobs, no stories, no careers. You can have all the noble intentions in the world, but if no one sees your movie, then it's not changing anything. You're just whispering into the void. But shouldn't art be more than just commerce? Stephanopoulos pushed art. Eastwood's laugh was low, scornful. You want to talk to me about art? I've been making art longer than you've been breathing. Real art, the kind that connects with people, not the kind that wins awards and dies on arrival because it's more concerned with being correct than being honest. You sit there judging what art is, but you've never had to make it. The temperature in the studio dropped again. Stephanopoulos tried to salvage his dignity. Look, Clint, he began, forcing a smile that now looked more like a grimace. I think we've gotten a little off track. All I wanted was an honest conversation about your career and its impact. Eastwood leaned forward, cutting him off before the sentence even landed. There's nothing honest about what you've done here. You didn't want a conversation. You wanted a moment. You brought me here under the guise of talking about my film, and instead, you set a trap. You tried to paint me as a relic, a roadblock to your version of progress. That's not journalism. George, that's manipulation. Stephanopoulos raised his hand slightly as if to say he meant no harm. I resent that characterization. Resent it all you want, Eastwood said, his voice now colder than steel. It's the truth. You had a narrative written before. I even walked on this set. Everything I've said, you've twisted. Every answer, you've framed. You didn't come here to listen. You came here to judge. The studio was frozen. Not a breath stirred. Not a cough, not a whisper. Not even the hum of machinery could soften the air between the two men. Stephanopoulos sat visibly shaken, but not enough to let go of the interview. I think you're being unfair, he said, but it lacked conviction. It was clear that whatever confidence he had begun with was now reduced to a thin veneer. Eastwood looked at him for a long moment, and then, instead of snapping back, his voice dropped to something quieter, almost ... tired. You know what's unfair, George? Inviting someone on your show to promote their work, then turning it into a public trial. You don't care about my career. You don't care about film. You just want a headline. Something you can tweet later to get applause from your followers. His words sank deep. Stephanopoulos' jaw tensed, but he had no retort. Clint Eastwood unhooked his microphone with the calmness of a man who had made his decision long before the host realized the gravity of his mistake. Wait, Stephanopoulos said quickly, the panic now rising in his voice. We're not finished. Oh, we're finished, Eastwood replied, standing slowly. I don't have to sit here and listen to a sanctimonious lecture from someone who's never spent a day creating something. I came here out of respect for the show, the audience, the craft, but you clearly had other plans. You can't just walk off, Stephanopoulos said, trying to appeal to professionalism. This is live television. Watch me, Eastwood said. He dropped the microphone onto the chair with a sharp metallic thud. The sound rang through the studio like a gunshot. All eyes followed him as he turned to the cameras, not to the host, not to the producers, but directly to the audience watching from their homes. Folks, he said, voice even, but loaded with sincerity. I apologize that you had to witness this today. I came here to talk about storytelling, the kind that entertains, challenges, and hopefully means something. But instead, I got ambushed. Because apparently, if you've worked hard for decades and earned some success, that's now something to be interrogated unless you wear the right political label. Stephanopoulos tried to speak again, but Eastwood cut him off with a look. The kind of look that silenced outlaws in old westerns, that made entire rooms fall quiet in his films. And now, it silenced a nationally televised broadcast. I've spent my life telling stories about underdogs, about fighters, about people just trying to do right in a world that's constantly changing the rules. If those stories aren't politically fashionable anymore, that's not my problem. I'll keep telling them anyway. He turned back toward the exit. Each footstep echoed in the stillness of the studio. Stephanopoulos sat frozen, his expression a mix of humiliation and disbelief. This was not how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the moment he had planned. As Eastwood reached the edge of the set, he stopped once more. Without turning around, he offered one final sentence. Next time you bring someone on your show, George, try listening instead of lecturing. And then he was gone. The studio door closed behind him with a soft but decisive click. The silence left in his wake was thunderous. Stephanopoulos sat there, blinking, his polished exterior shattered. His next words, whatever they were meant to be, never came. The audience was motionless, the crew unsure of whether to cut to commercial or let the moment speak for itself. The cameras kept rolling. Backstage, producers scrambled, debating whether to issue an apology, spin the segment, or bury the footage entirely. But it was too late. Within minutes, the clip was already circulating on social media. Millions of viewers had witnessed what would soon be called one of the most devastating live television walk-offs in history. And the public reaction, overwhelmingly, in favor of Eastwood, across platforms, hashtags exploded. Hashtag Clint walks out. Hashtag Eastwood unfiltered. Hashtag Legacy V's agenda. Comment sections filled with applause, disbelief, and a palpable sense that something profound had just occurred. Not just a clash of personalities, but a collision of ideologies, of old-world grit versus modern media performance, of experience versus agenda. Commentators, analysts, and celebrities began weighing in. Some called Eastwood stubborn, others called him brave. But one thing was universally agreed upon. The man hadn't lost a step. If anything, he reminded the world why his presence still commands reverence. Because he doesn't flinch, he doesn't perform. He simply is. As the hours passed, Stephanopoulos' silence only added fuel to the fire. ABC issued a carefully worded statement, acknowledging that the segment had not gone as intended, and vowing to review their interview practices. But the damage was done. For all his credentials and experience, George had been publicly outmatched, outclassed, and outlasted by a 94-year-old film legend. Meanwhile, Eastwood returned to his trailer.com as ever. When asked by his assistant if he wanted to issue a statement or tweet a response, he simply shook his head. Let the work speak for itself, he said, and that was that. Later that evening, a clip of Eastwood's final words on the show replayed. On every major network, news anchors struggled to find neutral language, but the public had already made up its mind. The quiet dignity of his walkout stood in stark contrast to the performative chaos of modern media. Hollywood insiders began whispering that the moment had reignited interest in his film. Studios that had passed on wide distribution were now reconsidering. Film festivals rushed to screen it. And in the days that followed, something unexpected happened. Young filmmakers, actors, and even critics began posting tributes. Not necessarily agreeing with everything he'd said, but admiring his refusal to bend, his commitment to craft, and his utter rejection of hollow applause. For Stephanopoulos, the fallout was swift. While his supporters tried to reframe the narrative, it was clear he had overreached. What should have been a celebration of Eastwood's career became a cautionary tale of what happens when ego eclipses empathy. In bars, film schools, and boardrooms across the country, people watched and rewatched the interview. Not just for the drama, but for the lesson. You don't disrespect a man who's earned his place, who's lived the work, and who's still standing, long after the world tried to write him off. So, what do you think about Clint Eastwood's legendary exit from Good Morning America? Did George Stephanopoulos get what he deserved for trying to ambush one of Hollywood's last true icons? Or was this simply a generational clash, inevitable and overdue? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, because moments like this, they don't come around often.